folks, everybody sing. Now when the saints go marching in, there is a house in New Orleans. Pumped a lot of pain down in New Orleans.
We took a little bacon and we took a little beans and we caught the bloody British in a town in New Orleans.
Yes, I want to be in that number. When the saints go marching in.
Welcome back to the history of New Orleans. We last left off with the beginning of the Reconstruction era in the South. This period in American history saw massive social upheaval imposed on the former Confederate states by the federal government using a military occupation. The justification for such extreme action was twofold. One was that although the split between the Union and the Confederacy had only lasted 4 years, it did bring to the forefront of discussion the reality of America since its founding. That it was essentially two countries, stitched together delicately simply by the coincidence of them having both been former colonies of Great Britain. The South was generally more agrarian, with huge parcels of land owned by aristocratic landlords that established a strict social hierarchy. The rich whites were on top, owning most of the land and growing fabulously wealthy off the sale of cash crops such as cotton, tobacco, and sugar. Below them were the poor whites, who either eked out a living by practically subsistence farming tiny plots of land, or were employed by the rich whites, who used them as managers and overseers of their massive estates. Below everyone were the black slaves, who made up about a third of the population, and who did most of all the manual labor of growing the cash crops that fueled the South's economy, whilst reaping none of the profits. This social and economic hierarchy was the bedrock on top of which everything in the South was built upon. When discussing the politics, culture, and character of the South, one must keep in mind that it was all tainted by the sin of slavery. By the time the Civil War ended on April 9, 1865, this social and economic hierarchy was obliterated. The Emancipation Proclamation declared the end of slavery in the South and was enforced through the presence of Union troops in all the rebelling states. The infrastructure, from railroad and telegraph lines to plantations and factories, were destroyed by the Union Army in order to achieve victory over the rebels. Despite the near total destruction of the superstructure of the old slaveocracy system, it would not be swept away so quickly. That brings us to our second reason for the military occupation. The white population of the South had spent nearly 200 years oppressing the enslaved black population, and they weren't about to just give that up because some Yankee Northerners told them it was wrong. Even if they couldn't return to a time of slavery, they would have to be dragged kicking and screaming into the new era of civil liberty. There was an irrational yet deep-rooted fear among the white population that should black people get the right to vote, then they would use their political power to oppress the whites in retribution for slavery. This fear was used by wealthier whites to stoke resentment among the poor whites that now that they were competing with black people for jobs and political power, that they would lose what little power they had in the old system. In reality, now that slavery was ended and black people entered the labor force as nominally equal partners, these poor whites had more in common materially with them than with the rich whites. Racism would keep the working classes separated, but we will discuss more on that later. For now, we will refocus our story back on New Orleans, which has always had a noticeably different experience when compared to other southern cities. Recall that New Orleans already had a significant population of free people of color prior to the end of slavery, which had also managed to acquire some economic power within the city. Now that Reconstruction had extended the franchise to all people, regardless of color, race, or gender, scratch that last one, there was an opportunity for these economically advantaged people of color to assert themselves further on the character of New Orleans. They were aided in this cause by the newly appointed mayor and his patron, the military general in charge of the 5th Military District of Texas and Louisiana, General Sheridan. Both the new mayor, Edward Heath, and General Sheridan held sympathies with the radical Republicans who controlled the legislative branch of the federal government at this time. They sought to improve the condition of black people within New Orleans over the protests of the wealthy and politically powerful white elites. To do this, they needed control over the municipal government, but the elections of 1867 had seen the ardently white supremacist Democrats capture both the executive and the legislative branches of the government. The executive branch was taken care of when Heath replaced Monroe as mayor, but there was still the issue of the legislative city council. Heath and Sheridan decided to use the issue of public schooling as a weapon against this body. The state constitution had required all municipalities to provide public schooling for both black and white children. Despite the fact that the City Council of New Orleans would have been happy to just ignore this part of the Constitution, they knew that Sheridan was looking for any excuse to depose them, so they swallowed their disgust and drafted a bill that appropriated some funds for separate black schools to be established in New Orleans. Heath, being a radical Republican, immediately vetoed this bill on account that it segregated the school system. The council overrode his veto, but little did they know that was exactly what Sheridan wanted. On the pretense that the legislative branch was acting in direct opposition to the executive, and thus impeding the efficient administration of the city, he removed 22 city council members and replaced them with Republicans. The majority of these Republicans were the relatively wealthy people of color who had lived in New Orleans before the Civil War. These men were the first black people to serve at this level in the city government, and it is a testament to how racist the voting body of the city was at this time that they had to be appointed by military decree rather than voted in by the general population. This was the general state of affairs under the supervision of Sheridan. Anytime the recalcitrant Democrats pushed against Reconstruction, they were promptly removed from office by military decree and replaced by an appointee of Sheridan's choosing. But Sheridan and Heath knew that this practice could not continue forever. They would need to find a more enduring way to keep the reactionaries out of power. To this end, in April of 1867, Sheridan began his duty of registering voters under the Registration Acts approved by Congress earlier that year. These acts had two purposes. One, to extend the franchise to newly freed people of color. The other, to disenfranchise reactionary elements of the white population that had betrayed the country during the Civil War. Service in the Confederate Army or proof of personal action taken against the Union was used to deny the right to vote to a significant portion of the white population in New Orleans. By the time the registration ended in July, there were 14,845 white men registered and 14,805 black men registered. Keep in mind that around this time, there were about 40,000 total black people in New Orleans, while there were 150,000 white people. Now, of course, the total population is not exactly analogous to the voting population, since women and those under the age of 21 could not vote. But taking that into account, there was still a significant difference in representation. The discrepancy between the registration rolls and the actual ratio of black to white in the population was expected, as Sheridan was looking to register those loyal to America and committed to the mission of Reconstruction. Obviously, the newly freed black population was more committed to the cause of securing their rights in the new America than the recently rebellious Confederate whites. The registration of voters came just in time, as by mid-August of 1867, President Johnson, who was fully against Reconstruction and the radical Republican mission, reached his breaking point with Sheridan and removed him from command of the 5th Military District by executive order. He was to be replaced by General Hancock, who had up to this point been overseeing federal troops maintaining peace in Missouri. Hancock was much more open to working with the Democrats than Sheridan had been, and so he was much more popular among the white population of New Orleans. He supported the creation of a segregated public school system simply for the fact that he did not see the whites as open to the idea of schooling their children alongside black kids. He believed that the purpose of the school system was to educate, not to promote the mixing of the races. Well, actually it is both. As we will see for the next 100 years, the issue of integration will be the defining issue of America, as reactionaries understood that racism's greatest threat was an integrated population who thought of each other based on their shared interests, rather than their differences. Schools are where the conception of what a good society is taught to the future generation, and so is the perfect vehicle for social change, not just for preparing for future careers. Hancock and the city council could not come to agreement on this front, so the whole issue was tabled for the time being. The school issue was just one part of the titanic struggle within New Orleans society at this point. The The radical Republicans were pushing against centuries of entrenched social values in the South, and in the Crescent City, and the friction between them and the Democrats will define the Reconstruction era. Whilst this battle between those who wanted radical Reconstruction and those who wanted to moderate or even forego it was underway, there was also yet another constitutional convention convening in New Orleans. It had only been 2 years since the last convention had been interrupted by a violent mob that had massacred peaceful supporters of civil rights. This new convention convened with the express purpose of completing the mission the one in 1866 had set out to do, and for the first time the delegates to the convention represented both the white and the black communities. The black members were drawn again from that slightly more privileged group of educated and relatively wealthy New Orleanian free people of color. The white members came largely from outside of Louisiana. These were sympathetic Northern Republicans that flooded into the Southern states during this time of great political upheaval to tip the scales of justice towards the Reconstruction cause. The Democrats and other white supremacist groups called these adventurers carpetbaggers. Any delegate who was native to Louisiana and was not black was dubbed by these same groups as a scalawag. I don't think we need to go into all the horrible names the black delegates were called by these groups. Despite the derisive language being thrown the way of these delegates, the convention was able to proceed without the major violence that had interrupted the previous one. The constitution they came up with in March of 1868 was similar to the one made in 1864, which was in turn similar to the one made in 1852. The notable additions to this version were further clarification on who could vote, a reordering of representation in the state legislature to take into account total population of parishes rather than the number of voters, meaning that for the first time women were at least tacitly considered when discussing political representation, and a clear commitment to an integrated society. To understand how ahead of the times on civil rights the radical Reconstruction era was, this constitution called for the equal treatment of black and white patrons to public places and unequivocally established a school system where white and black children would learn in the same classroom. It would be nearly 100 years after this constitution was ratified that 6-year-old Ruby Bridges would attend an all-white elementary school in New Orleans and finally break segregation in the city. The final notable part of the 1868 state constitution was a provision that took its inspiration from the 1864 convention by stating that if the constitution could not be ratified by popular referendum, then the same group of delegates would reconvene to try again. The popular referendum was scheduled for April 17th, and the convention decided that it would be convenient if the state and New Orleans also held elections for public office on this date. That made 1868 a big year for elections, as in November there would also be the first presidential election since the end of the Civil War, and since Louisiana was slated to rejoin the Union as a state in June, it would participate. It should be obvious that there was a lot at stake during this election. If either the radical Republicans or the conservative Democrats gained power over both the state and the municipal governments, then the direction of Reconstruction would be shifted drastically. At this point, the military commander in charge of the 5th Military District still had a relatively free hand to interfere with elected officials, but General Buchanan, who had replaced General Hancock after he resigned over a conflict with General Ulysses S. Grant, knew that it would be much easier to govern New Orleans with the backing of these elected officials rather than their opposition. Surprisingly, the state Democratic Party decided not to contest the gubernatorial election and instead focused their energy in New Orleans, hoping to win decisively here and keep the largest city in the South under conservative governance. The Democrats did, however, choose to throw their timid support towards the moderate Republican candidate for governor in hopes that he would be less disruptive than his radical opponent. When Election Day came, black people turned out in droves to vote for the first time in New Orleans. However, despite all the progress that had been made over the last few years, this was still the South, and there was still the deeply ingrained belief that whites and people of color should not mix. To this end, the lines at each poll were segregated, with white voters and black voters submitting their ballots alternatingly so that they did not mingle. Luckily, though, for the second time in a row, there were no reports of violence at the polls, and although the Democrats made a big stink about alleged election fraud, the whole process went over smoothly. The Democrats managed to do what they had set out to and secured the mayoral office, along with the majority of the seats on the city council. They did not, however, see success in the statewide elections. Radical Republican Henry Warmoth won the governorship. The new state constitution was ratified, and New Orleans native Oscar Dunn became the first African American lieutenant governor of his state. Dunn would also become the first African American acting governor when he took over for Warmoth for a month when he injured his foot. Dunn is notable not just because of the color of his skin, but also because of his socioeconomic background. Unlike the people of color we have seen gain political power during the Reconstruction up to this point, Dunn did not come from the wealthy Creole class in New Orleans. He was born into slavery, and even after he was free, he had to work as a contractor. Dunn is a perfect example of how not only the racial dynamics in America were changing at this time, but also class dynamics were beginning to shift as well. Dunn and Warmoth would do their best to carry out the mission of Reconstruction in Louisiana, even without the support of its most important city. Even though the Republicans had lost the New Orleans elections, General Buchanan was still committed to scaling back the level of military presence in the administration of the city. Once the state legislature ratified the 14th Amendment, which gave citizenship to all people born in the United States, regardless of race, it was readmitted into the Union, and General Buchanan declared the end to military authority over civil government. This was naturally accompanied by the withdrawal of federal troops from New Orleans. As it turned out, this scaling back of military presence in the Louisiana capital was premature and ill-advised. The removal of armed men charged with the protection of black people and maintaining the peace emboldened white supremacist elements within New Orleans to form paramilitary groups like the Knights of the White Camellia and the Crescent City Democratic Club. These groups were analogous to the infamous Ku Klux Klan, but notably at this point in time, their goal was not to fight a protracted terrorist campaign against black people in the South, but rather a more limited campaign to intimidate and harass Republican voters in the upcoming presidential election. Since the Democrats had lost the statewide elections, they hoped by delivering Louisiana's electoral votes to the Democratic candidate in the presidential election that they could overthrow the whole regime of Reconstruction from the top down. Governor Warmoth was not oblivious to this plan or to the formation of these dangerous terrorist groups in New Orleans. In order to combat the rise of militant white supremacy and to secure his own power within the state government, one of the first acts by the new governor was to form the Metropolitan Police. For quite a long time, one of the major issues plaguing New Orleans politics was the police force. They were at times either too powerful, too weak, too loyal to a particular party, or too loyal to their own interests. Whoever controlled the city government naturally needed the police in order to project their power over New Orleans, and so finding the proper balance was crucial. Warmoth now looked to supersede the power projection of the Democratic officials in New Orleans by creating a new metropolitan police force that would serve at the behest of the state government rather than the local one. It seems like just as soon as New Orleans freed itself from the yoke of the military occupation, it was now subjugated under the absolute control of the state government. This was not without good reason. The state has an obligation to protect all of its citizens, including those with dark skin, and if the city government is unable or unwilling to take up this task, then it falls to the state to take extreme action. Despite the formation of the heavily armed Metropolitan Police, the work of the Knights of White Camellia achieved its goal in November of 1868, when Republican voters largely avoided the voting booth for their own safety, and the state was won by the Democrats. However, this was not enough to tip the scales nationally, and Republican Ulysses S. Grant ended up winning handedly in the Electoral College and became the 18th President of the United States. The violent actions of the Knights of White Camellia and the Ku Klux Klan led to the passage of the Enforcement Act, which renewed and extended peacekeeping authority to the Army in the South. This resulted in much fairer elections during the rest of the Reconstruction period, as the Army was able to suppress white supremacist terrorists and protect black voters. After the drama of the elections of 1868 came 2 years of consolidation of power from the Louisiana state government. Warmoth's biggest goal was to subvert the loss of New Orleans to the Democrats by solidifying power over the city under the state government. We already have seen how he did this by establishing the Metropolitan Police, but now in 1869 and 1870, he took further action by establishing the State Board of Education to ensure the integration of the New Orleans' school system, and called for a new city charter, one that would fix the financial problems that had plagued the city since the Civil War and completely reshape the face of the city government. Under the new charter, Jefferson City and Algiers were annexed by New Orleans, but those were just the changes to the territorial boundaries of the city. Within the government, there was a huge change-up. The new charter stipulated that the city would be run by a city council that was made up of a mayor and 7 administrators. These administrators would be the heads of 7 departments, those being finance, commerce, improvement, police, assessments, public accounts and public building, and waterworks. The real big shakeup here was that the only power the mayor held in this new system was to choose which administrator would head each department and to vote in case of a tie. All the real power lay in the hands of the 7 administrators, who were elected by popular vote. This was a huge reduction in the power of the mayor, which meant that the Democrats could no longer rely on the strategy of focusing all their energy on this all-important office. As a result, the Democrats were really directionless, and in the 1870 elections, the Republicans managed to secure the mayorship and all the administrator positions. There was finally unity between the New Orleans government, the state government, and the federal government. At least there would have been unity if it wasn't for the inherent tendency towards disorder of party politics, that is, political entropy. This characteristic comes into play often when a single party completely eclipses their rivals. Factions begin to form within the dominant party, which will eventually lead to a bitter struggle between previous allies. In New Orleans and Louisiana, in the broader picture, the 2 most antagonistic of these new factions were the Custom House Ring and the supporters of Governor Warmoth, who, for the purpose of this broadcast, will be referred to as liberal Republicans. These 2 factions split on many issues, but the one that ultimately drove a wedge between them was political patronage. As much as the 1860s and 70s were a period of great social upheaval, they were also a continuation of the most perpetual problems of government: graft and corruption. The Custom House Ring got their name from the fact that their leaders, U.S. Marshal Stephen Packard and Customs Collector James Casey, controlled the Customs House in New Orleans, which doled out positions to their cronies, which were prime for extracting the most personal wealth out of their constituents. Casey himself was a beneficiary of the patronage system, as he only got this powerful position thanks to his brother-in-law, President Grant. Likewise, Warmoth used the power of the governor's office and his metropolitan police to set up a competing network of patronage in New Orleans and Louisiana. Both factions quickly began ignoring important civil rights issues as much as they could as they greedily struggled to usurp the other's corrupt enterprise. There were, however, less powerful political factions within New Orleans that we can think of as swing voters. The 2 dominant parties would have to compete for support of these lesser factions in order to win any election. Among these swing voters were newly enfranchised black voters, mostly Republicans, whose main motivation was the continuation and expansion of Reconstruction civil rights progress. Arranged against them were the Democrats, who, thanks to voting laws that restricted them and the ascendancy of the Republican Party in the state and national politics, were relegated to the background. Even with such an obvious rallying point as opposition to Reconstruction, the Democrats could not help but also succumb to political entropy. They split into the Bourbon Democrats, who were hardline reactionaries who opposed everything to do with Reconstruction, and Reformers, who conceded that they would have to live with black political equality, but hoped that they could push back against social equality. As Warmoth's term was drawing to a close in 1872, the state capital of New Orleans was abuzz with party conventions of various groups hoping to seize control of the Crescent City, not through municipal elections, but state ones. The neutering of the mayor and the local police meant that if anyone wanted to assert influence over New Orleans, it was no longer feasible to do so just by winning local elections. They would also need support from the state. The Democrats, both Bourbon and Reformers, resolved to put aside their differences to support a single ticket for the governorship and lower offices. The Republicans remained divided, with one group coalescing around PBS Pinchback, who had served a year as lieutenant governor after Dunn's death in 1871. Pinchback was the son of a slave and her owner, who grew up in Georgia as a free man and served as an officer in the Union Army in New Orleans. As a prominent African American and fighter for civil rights, Pinchback had the respect and support of a large portion of the black population, and he hoped that these voters would be enough to carry him to victory. Well, actually, Pinchback didn't want to be governor. Instead, he hoped that his support among the black community would be enough to earn him a favorable position on the Custom House ticket. This ticket was led by William Kellogg, a carpetbagger from Illinois. Since the Custom House ring had secured the black vote by including Pinchback, Warmoth knew that he had to find votes elsewhere. He looked to the Democrats and ended up throwing his substantial political base behind their nominee, John McHenry. So when Election Day came on November 4th, it was a contest between Republican William Kellogg and Democrat John McHenry. If the Democrats wanted an easy road to establishing their dominance over New Orleans and the rest of Louisiana, they would also have to win the municipal elections. Just like on the statewide ticket, liberal Republicans offered their support to whoever the Democrats nominated just to spoil the chances of their rivals in the Custom House ring. After a back-and-forth debate, the Democratic Committee in New Orleans settled on a ticket led by Louis Wiltz, who traced his roots in New Orleans back to some of the first German settlers in the early 1700s. His notoriety was bolstered by his partnership with local hero and notable traitor to the Union, General P.G.T. Beauregard. With the support of the Liberals and a star-studded ticket, the Democrats easily swept the elections in New Orleans. The state elections were another matter. Naturally, such an important and contested election was bound to stir up some drama, but I doubt anyone was prepared for just how chaotic the gubernatorial election of 1872 became. To begin, the casting of ballots on November 4th lacked the bloody violence of pre-Civil War elections, as once again the Metropolitan Police did their jobs of protecting the polls. On the other hand, there were rampant cases of fraud from both sides, with every underhanded electoral tactic in the book being practiced. In the end, under a heavy cloud of controversy and skepticism, it seemed like McHenry and the Democrats had clinched the win. However, there was one more important step in the certification of the election results that could change the outcome. According to the state constitution, the votes had to be tallied and certified by an executive board consisting of the sitting governor, lieutenant governor, and Secretary of State, and 2 other men chosen by the first 3. In order to ensure the most drama possible, the board set up along these guidelines was a collection of intractable enemies. Governor Warmoth and Lieutenant Governor Pinchback were the heads of the 2 competing factions. It was doubtful that they would ever come to an agreement on the outcome of the election. To rectify this conundrum, Warmoth summarily dismissed all of his opponents on the board and replaced them with his allies. Those men that had been given the boot went on to form their own board, which they claimed held the true authority to certify the results. The 2 boards battled it out in federal court for months, with twists and turns that don't bear elaborating on. What we really care about is that by the end of the year, a federal judge had declared Kellogg the winner, an opinion supported by the United States Attorney General and President Grant. At the same time, Warmoth was impeached on grounds of his interference in the election, and Pinchback became the first African-American governor of a U.S. state, for a total of 35 days until Kellogg was sworn in. This result was obviously rejected by McHenry and the Democrats, but for now all they could do was establish a rival government in exile that exercised no concrete legal authority. But the very existence of this protest government stirred emotions in New Orleans, especially among radical white supremacist agitators, who, since before the end of the Civil War, had been looking for any opportunity to overthrow the new social order. In March of 1873, these radicals became so heated that, at the urging of McHenry, they attempted to overthrow the Kellogg government by force. The Metropolitan Police stepped in and easily put down the uprising, which led to a speedy disbanding of the opposition government. But this did not solve the problem of illegitimacy that Kellogg's government was faced with, and it would not be the last time that violence was considered as a solution to political issues in New Orleans. In fact, it did nothing more than confirm to the opponents of civil rights that they had no recourse under the law to fight their battle for white supremacy, and must therefore stage an armed insurrection to expel Republicans from New Orleans. Organizations built around this goal had been popping up in Louisiana at least since 1868. For instance, there were the Knights of the White Camellia that we have already discussed. There were also local New Orleans organizations, like the Crescent City Democratic Club. These gatherings of white reactionaries had over the last 6 years or so attempted with very little success to influence the course of events in New Orleans and Louisiana. The lack of success can largely be attributed to wavering conviction within the reactionary ranks, as some of them still believed that they could use peaceful political power to return to the status quo of the antebellum South. It can also be attributed to the Enforcement Act, which gave a broad mandate to federal troops in the South to combat white supremacist paramilitaries. This act was losing popularity among the general population, and by 1875 it would be completely defanged by the U.S. Supreme Court. Before that happened, however, there was going to be a cataclysmic confrontation in New Orleans. The uncertainty of the municipal election guaranteed it. In April of 1874, in Opelousas, a city about 60 miles east of Baton Rouge and 140 miles east of New Orleans, the first meeting of the White League convened. Opelousas had been the center of some of the worst racial violence of the last decade, when a reactionary mob murdered up to 300 black Republicans over anger at the state constitution of 1868. Since then, it has been a hotbed of white supremacist rhetoric. The White League represented an amalgamation of the armed wing of the reactionary movement and the political wing. It was endorsed and led by many prominent politicians and businessmen in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, and its ranks were swelled by rural whites who feared losing their livelihoods because of competition from newly freed slaves. In this organization, rural whites and urban whites came together in a way that hadn't been seen since the founding of the Confederacy. It was a recipe for disaster. As the League spread its evil tendrils across the state, it quickly became clear that the military arm of this organization was unlike the mobs that had formed previously. It consisted of ex-Confederate soldiers led by ex-Confederate officers with military discipline and training. Over the next few months, they would drill and train together until they became a force to be reckoned with, one that could go toe-to-toe with the Metropolitan Police and the Federal Army. Now, the White League had been founded as a secret society to plan the subversion of the state and the New Orleans administrations, but as they grew and spread, it became harder and harder to keep their existence a secret from the Metropolitan Police. Eventually, they decided that it was no longer worth the trouble, and they announced their presence to the world by publishing a White League Constitution in the New Orleans papers. The rallying call of the Constitution states some pretty heinous stuff along the lines of racial supremacy that does not bear repeating, but suffice it to say, it was clear to everyone exactly who the White League opposed. Finally, in September of 1874, the government decided to take action to prevent the rise of the White League. When they caught word that the steamship Mississippi was making its way to New Orleans with a shipment of weapons for the reactionary paramilitary, they immediately began moving to block it. The League, having heard that their supply of arms was about to be cut off, quickly moved towards the action they had been planning for months. Their plan was to place armed men in buildings near the State House so that when the administration met there, they could rush in and kidnap Kellogg and his officers. They would then ship these men out to a foreign port so that McHenry could take control of the government in their absence. All the leaders of the White League signed off on this plan, but McHenry was hesitant because he thought there was no way to get the hostages out of New Orleans before the Metropolitan Police and the federal troops responded. If they did, then there would be a full-scale battle fought on the streets of New Orleans. Still, against McHenry's protests, preparations continued for the operation. The city waited with bated breath. On Monday, September 14th, there was a rally held around the statue of Henry Clay on Canal Street. It saw 5,000 white supremacists gather there to listen to fiery speeches delivered by White League leaders. At the end of the rally, around noon, Cornelius Beard of the White League urged the crowd to disperse back to their homes, but to return to the statue at 2:30, armed. As the mob filed back to their homes to gather their weapons, the League political leaders met with the military leaders at their headquarters on Camp Street. McHenry was conveniently out of state while this was all going down, in order to preserve some semblance of innocence. The rest of the League conferred with each other and came to the conclusion that there would never be an opportunity like the one today, when both the paramilitary and the mob were on the same page, and decisive action was called for. About 10 blocks north of this gathering, the forces of freedom and equality were arrayed around Jackson Square. There was a militia of around 3,000 people of color who had taken up arms to protect their newly won freedom. They were joined by several hundred Metropolitan Police and 150 federal troops. A large number of working-class people of color had also gathered in the Custom House to seek refuge from the reactionary gangs. They were separated from the wealthier people of color, who gathered in relatively greater safety in the State House. All around Jackson Square there was a general anxiety about the violent confrontation that was now inevitable. Around 3 p.m., General Longstreet, commander of the Metropolitan Police and overall commander of the Forces of Freedom, moved his men to create a defensive line at Canal Street. They would be supported by artillery posted at Bienville Street. The White League formed up opposite them on Poydras Street. The two sides first engaged around 3:30 when White Leaguers began assaulting Canal Street. Their goal was to engage the Forces of Freedom and then withdraw to bait them into abandoning their fortified positions in pursuit. Longstreet's men did not fall for this bait, so very little was achieved in the first half hour of the battle. Then, around 4 o'clock, General Ogden, Supreme Commander of the White League paramilitary, led an assault along the riverbank to flank the Forces of Freedom. The success of this flanking maneuver, and a subsequent one on the opposite side of the battlefield at 4:15, forced Longstreet to withdraw his men to Jackson Square. By now, dozens of men on each side had been either killed or wounded, and the streets of New Orleans were running red with blood. As the Forces of Freedom retreated, the White League opted not to pursue them, and by 6 o'clock both sides had retired to their camps, one at Jackson Square and the other at Poydras Street. The casualty numbers were 21 Leaguers killed and 19 wounded. 11 Metropolitan policemen died and 60 were wounded. While the Leaguers had died for a cause of hate and evil, the Metropolitans died nobly to protect the ideals of the Republic, those of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, for all, not just white citizens. Among the dead Metropolitans was one former Confederate officer, showing that even in these divisive times, there were those that saw a better future for all Americans, despite what they had fought for previously. A curious characteristic of what would later be known as the Battle of Liberty Place was that it was somewhat of a spectator event. Civilians in New Orleans were able to witness the entire bloody conflict from their balconies, or from the decks of passing steamships. Some of them even mingled with the combatants as the battle was raging. Surprisingly, none of these spectators were killed or injured. In the end, the Forces of Freedom were completely demoralized by the loss on September 14th, so that by the following morning they were prepared to surrender and abandon their positions in Jackson Square. The White League strode triumphantly to the State House and declared absolute victory for the insurrection. Kellogg and his officers fled, and the reactionary pseudo-government headed by McHenry took their place. It was a moment of absolute ascendancy for the White League and the Democrats, one that would last a total of 3 days. Up north in D.C., news of the battle in New Orleans was met with outrage and fear. There was a general suspicion that the violent overthrow of the Republican government in Louisiana was the first shot fired in another civil war. Wanting to stamp out any chance of this fire spreading, President Grant authorized the full force of the Federal Army to squash the rebellion in New Orleans. However, the White Leaguers had no intention of starting another civil war, or coming into direct conflict with the U.S. military. They hoped that their insurrection would prove to the federal government that it would be too much trouble for them to impose racial equality on the South through force alone, and that they should surrender control of the governance in these states to the whites. This was an opinion that was growing in popularity across the country, as the fire of liberty that had raged during the Civil War was slowly being smothered by the prolonged and bitter Reconstruction. The intransigence of white Southern elites was wearing down the morale of Northern Republicans. Before long, the North would abandon their black constituents in the South, but that time had not yet come. President Grant immediately ordered a naval vessel to sail to New Orleans and dispatched General Emory along with a company of infantry to retake the city. Like I said, the White League did not want to come into conflict with the U.S. military, so they willingly handed over all the property they had seized on the 14th, while hoping that the Federals would stop short at reinstating Kellogg to his post. They did not stop, however, and by September 18th, the rightful governor was back in power. It was a Pyrrhic victory for freedom and equality, as the national mood swung decisively against the Republicans for the first time, and the reactionary Democrats gained a majority in Congress in the national elections 6 weeks after the Battle of Liberty Place. This effectively signed the death notice for Reconstruction. And so it is in New Orleans that we can really see the beginning of the end for Reconstruction. The period did not officially end until President Rutherford B. Hayes recalled all federal troops from the South in 1877. But here in 1874, it truly became doomed. Oh, Reconstruction, what started with so much hope, optimism, and promise, ended with such bitterness and regression. It is truly one of the greatest tragedies in America in New Orleans history. The overall goal of Reconstruction was to reshape the South in the image of the North after the Civil War. While the North was far from perfect, it did offer a better alternative to the slavocracy that had ruled the South for over 100 years. The North was more industrialized, the standard of living for the average American was higher here, there was more harmony between the races, ethnicities, and religions. Across the board, it was a better place to live for the average person. Reconstruction tried to uplift the South into this era of modernity, and the white reactionaries never forgave the North for that. New Orleans was perhaps hit hardest by the failure of Reconstruction more than any other city in the South. The Crescent City was the greatest beneficiary of the slave and plantation economy, and the end of this system wrecked the city's finances. Instead of moving forward and uniting to fix the problems the city faced after the Civil War, the Democrats railed against the advancements in the rights of black people and hampered any progress that Republican administrations tried to implement. Racial animosity also divided the working classes of New Orleans, ensuring that political and economic power in the city would remain in the hands of the backwards and greedy wealthy elite. New Orleans, unlike any other city in the South, had a thriving population of free people of color before the Civil War, and this meant that anxieties among the ruling white people were even higher here than anywhere else. This is why we saw so much political violence in the city during this period, and why after Reconstruction, it would continue to be a battleground for civil rights. But before we move on to the post-Reconstruction era, I want to go over some of the biggest changes outside the political arena that came to New Orleans during this time. The 1860s and 70s brought about a lot of dramatic changes for everyone, but we should begin with the people whose lives changed the most, those being the people of color. The most obvious difference in the lives of a majority of black people before and after the Civil War was the end of slavery. The greatest evil mankind has ever inflicted upon itself began being abolished in Union-occupied territory during the Civil War, and New Orleans had the luxury of being captured within the first 2 years of the war, meaning that any enslaved person living in the city had a head start on freedom. But the end of slavery did not just affect those black people who had been enslaved. It also gave those already unshackled a chance to fight for more of the pie. More rights, more education, more economic opportunity. Before the Civil War even ended, the affluent Afro-Creole community in New Orleans was asserting itself more confidently in the city. The first black-run newspaper, the Tribune, began circulation in 1864, and it catered to both French-speaking and English-speaking readers. Of course, the issue of spreading black points of view through a newspaper was that due to anti-literacy laws, many former slaves did not know how to read. This is just one of the many gaps between the newly freed men and the former Afro-Creole elites. But the more educated and wealthy people of color did their best to bridge this gap. As we have mentioned, it was they who fought hardest in the political arena to enshrine the right to an equal opportunity for black people to become educated by the public school system. The teaching of black people in public school would remain a battleground in New Orleans and the rest of the country for over a century, but during Reconstruction, the side of equality saw its first victories. As the cause of civil liberty and justice saw advancements, it was met by backlash and reaction from a broad swath of the white population. Even as federal laws sought to enforce the new social order on the recalcitrant population, they continued to fight back against progress. Outside of politics, whites showed their aversion to freedom and equality by forming violent gangs to harass and assault black citizens in black-owned businesses. Racial animosity seeped into everything. Even the Mardi Gras parades, which had remained up to this point somewhat apolitical, the Reconstruction era saw the formation of 3 new crews, those of Rex, Proteus, and Momus. These crews were overtly political and used the pageantry of Carnival and Mardi Gras to showcase their disdain for the advancement of people of color. The original crew of Comus did not skip out on these political displays. In one infamous parade, they designed a float baked around Charles Darwin's Origin of Species, where they depicted many prominent Republican figures as animals, including the African-American lieutenant governor as a monkey. This was one of the first cases of white supremacists weaponizing the theory of evolution to depict black people as a separate species, as less than human. We today can look back at this evil use of the celebration of Mardi Gras with disgust, but back in 1873, the Darwin float was a huge hit. This was the time when Mardi Gras was really starting to become more than just a Deep South niche. By 1872, more than 30,000 people from around the country were visiting New Orleans just to see the parades. From now on, political and social commentary would become a defining feature of the New Orleans Mardi Gras celebrations, for better or for worse. It would be the white population of New Orleans that would dominate this field of political propaganda for the next 30-plus years, as it wouldn't be until the Krewe of Zulu was founded in 1909 that the African-American community got their own voice in the parades. Undergirding all the political and social upheaval of the 1860s and 70s were upheavals in the material conditions, the economic conditions. It is without a doubt that the billion-dollar industry of slavery was a huge portion of the New Orleans economy. Besides all the slaves who provided free labor for the city and its wealthy inhabitants, New Orleans also served as a transportation and auctioning hub for the entire Deep South. When slavery was abolished, it left a gaping hole in the New Orleans economy, and the turbulent years of Reconstruction were not a fertile environment for economic revitalization. Any attempts by a Republican government to try and fill the hole left by the freeing of the slaves was met with opposition from the reactionary white population, not on any logical grounds, but simply because they would not accept any solution offered by progressives. The political divide exacerbated the economic downturn in New Orleans, and in turn, the economic downturn stoked the anxieties of every citizen in the city. It was a self-perpetuating cycle that could only be arrested by the resolution of the political issues. Unfortunately, as we will see, this resolution came via the destruction of the New Orleans Republican Party and the ascendancy of Jim Crow. Beyond the damage that abolition did to New Orleans' economy, for a good cause, we must insist, there was the growing problem of the trajectory of America's development. In a previous episode, we talked about how the Transcontinental Railroad and several new canals had begun eating into New Orleans' monopoly as a trade hub for America. While New Orleans was staggering under the weight of Reconstruction and political conflict, cities in the Midwest were exploding. Chicago had been founded in 1833 by 300 settlers. By the end of Reconstruction in 1877, it had over 300,000 inhabitants. It was still growing. A large portion of the wealth from the Midwest that had previously flowed down the Mississippi to New Orleans was now diverted to Chicago. As a great migration west began, many stopped on their way to California and the West Coast, setting down their roots in Middle America. St. Louis, a more northern stop on the Mississippi, overtook New Orleans' population in the mid-1800s. By the end of Reconstruction, it was also nearing over 300,000 residents. America was quickly developing into a world power after the Civil War, but New Orleans was being left behind. As the American population ballooned in the 1860s and 70s, it also began concentrating in urban centers like New Orleans. America had always been a nation of small farm holders. When it was founded, just 1 in 20 Americans lived in cities. One might expect as manifest destiny took hold and the country expanded to new territories out west, that this trend would continue as even as the population grew, there was more and more land to spread out over. This, however, was not the case. By the 1870s, just over a quarter of Americans were now urbanites, and this trend would continue in this direction up to the modern day. The explanation for this trend is twofold: opportunity and technological innovation. For the former, cities offered more economic opportunity for skilled and unskilled laborers who did not have the means or the motivation to try their luck at farming. For the latter, technological innovations, specifically in farming techniques and equipment, meant that a smaller number of people could cultivate a larger area of land. This led to consolidation of farms, and the smallholder farmer was gradually edged out by huge farming corporations. New Orleans and Louisiana followed this broader trend in America at a somewhat slower pace. Plantation farming of cash crops had been the predominant industry in Louisiana during slavery, and that wasn't about to flip overnight when slavery was abolished. Even though black people were no longer being forced to work on plantations for no pay and with no rights, the demand for their labor was still there. Many attempts were made by the new labor force to organize for the purposes of procuring fair wages, but racial animosity among white and black sharecroppers, as well as terrorism from white supremacist paramilitaries, smothered the nascent labor movement in the cradle. Furthermore, due to anti-literacy laws and the lack of other educational opportunities, there were very few skills outside of farming that the formerly enslaved population possessed. Even those that did migrate from the fields into New Orleans found that they had to compete for manual labor jobs with immigrants who were still coming to the city in droves. This stoked racial tensions between newly freed men and Irish and German immigrants, splitting the working classes and allowing the wealthy to play each group against each other to drive down wages, thus making it less enticing for field hands to move to the city. For all these reasons and more, it wasn't until the 1950s that Louisiana finally became a predominantly urban population. But New Orleans was still growing. The rate might have decreased, and there were troubles abound, but the city continued to be an important fixture in America. It was still the largest city in the Deep South, and it was still an important trade hub. The city also continued during the Reconstruction period to be the most unique cultural destination in the United States. The culinary arts have always been important in New Orleans, and it owes its diversity of food to the diversity of the people who made it their home. As America became more urbanized and the middle class grew steadily, the number of restaurants catering to people outside the ultra-wealthy exploded. In the mid-1800s, thousands of new restaurants opened across America, many by recent European immigrants who brought with them the culinary tastes of that continent. In 1840, for example, Antoine Alciatori, an Italian-born and French-educated chef, opened his first restaurant. In 1868, it would move to sit on 713 St. Louis Street in New Orleans, and remains there to this day. It also remains the oldest family-owned restaurant in the country. Antoine's would contribute much to the culinary scene in New Orleans over the years, mostly specializing in elaborate and high-end cuisine. But there was another icon of New Orleans that opened around the same time that catered to the everyday street market patron and working man. That would be Café du Monde, which opened its stalls in New Orleans' French Market in 1862. Café du Monde specialized in café au lait and the French donuts that are a staple of New Orleans breakfast, called beignets. So we can see that even as New Orleans was experiencing the most turbulent times in its history during the Civil War and Reconstruction, some of its longest-lasting institutions were able to find their footing at this time and bring happiness to the troubled city. Nowhere was happiness and revelry more abound in New Orleans than on Bourbon Street, named after the French royal family. Despite its famous or infamous reputation today, before the Reconstruction era, Bourbon Street was actually a pretty tame area of the French Quarter. It, like most of the Quarter, was home to many wealthy and respectable Creole elites, and was home to the city's first Protestant church and Jewish synagogue. The first hint at Bourbon's turn towards its more libertine and raunchy character came in 1859 with the construction of the French Opera House. While this establishment wasn't the kind of seedy joint that would later spread all down the street, it was the first instance of the entertainment industry creeping its way into the neighborhood. Then, during Reconstruction, Just as the restaurant scene exploded with increased urbanization, the face of the French Quarter changed. The wealthy Creoles that lived there became more and more disturbed by the busyness of the inner city, and the 1860s saw the first flight to the suburbs. These snooty bourgeois citizens were replaced by poor, working-class immigrant families who likely did not have a nice suit and tie or dress to wear to the opera house. But these people still needed entertainment, and so concert saloons began popping up along Bourbon Street to cater to the lower class demand. These saloons were much more risque than the opera house, offering patrons a chance to indulge in their most undesirable desires through alcohol and sexualized dances. From here on out, Bourbon Street became known as the place you wanted to go to scratch that immoral itch. That isn't to say that all of New Orleans gained a reputation for this sort of lowbrow immoral entertainment during Reconstruction. There were plenty of well-respected, high-class artists who were drawn to the beauty and romance of the Crescent City. Among the plethora of venerated artists living and working in New Orleans during Reconstruction, I will highlight a few. There was Achille Pirelli, who is probably most well known as the artist behind the statue of Andrew Jackson and his horse in Jackson Square. His talents were procured during late Reconstruction by various interest groups to produce monuments and busts dedicated to Confederate figures like Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, and local legend P.G.T. Beauregard. Unfortunately, this means that Pirelli was a participant in the whitewashing and romanticization of the Confederacy in New Orleans. Also, unfortunately, this was the case for many talented artists in New Orleans during Reconstruction. During this era, if you wanted to make money as an artist, you mostly made it through commissions, and the only people with enough disposable cash to make said commissions were the fabulously wealthy elites, which were obviously the strongest bloc of Confederate supporters. Outside of the visual arts, however, there was a greater penchant for inclusivity. There was a great tradition of black musicians in New Orleans across a wide spectrum of genres. During Reconstruction, Samuel Snare, a Creole of color born in New Orleans, conducted in an orchestral performance of Edmond Didi's Quasimodo Symphony. Didi was another Creole of color who was born in New Orleans during the antebellum period. With Snare and Didi, we can see how the tradition of black people in classical music was being passed down generation to generation in New Orleans, even during this period of extreme racial tension. Unfortunately, we don't have enough time to go into all the great artists of many diverse disciplines and backgrounds in New Orleans during Reconstruction, so we will wrap up this section with a discussion of a unique figure in literature and journalism during this period. Eliza Jane Nicholson was not born in New Orleans. She came from an affluent Mississippi family who saw that she got a proper education, but still expected her to fulfill her duties as a woman during this time in history. That is to say, get married, have kids, don't have a career. However, Eliza had different plans. In the late 1860s, she moved to New Orleans and got a job as a journalist. The first professional woman journalist not only in New Orleans, but in the entire South. She was a good enough writer that in 1870, to the shock of her family and her male colleagues, she was named literary editor of Picayune, an established yet struggling newspaper in New Orleans. Only 2 years later, Eliza would marry the paper's owner, and when he died in 1876, she inherited ownership over the Picayune. Under her and her later second husband's supervision, the Picayune would become one of the most successful papers in the Southwest. Now, we would like to end this episode by mentioning the newcomers to New Orleans during Reconstruction. The biggest driver of immigration to the Crescent City during this period was the end of slavery. Like we already mentioned, the end of slavery did not mean an end to the plantation economy that was the bedrock of Southern society at this time. It just meant that black people were entering the labor force as free men. This meant that they had at least a semblance of choice as to where they worked, how much they made, and what jobs they did. This meant that many left the plantations to go to New Orleans or other cities in search of better opportunities. Consequently, the demand for fresh, cheap labor to toil in the fields skyrocketed. Into the void stepped some groups that we are already familiar with, and some that many listeners may be surprised to learn came to New Orleans during this time. Of the familiar, there were the Irish and the Italians. The Italians that came during Reconstruction were generally very poor Sicilians who were fleeing Italy due to political and economic troubles at home. In New Orleans and in America in general, Italians were considered outside the dominant white race. They weren't as discriminated against as black people, but they were largely excluded from Anglo-Irish and Jewish social spheres. This caused them to settle together in concentrated neighborhoods and to hold their language and culture closely, which would later diffuse into New Orleans, changing the character of the city, just as the Spanish and Americans had changed the once homogeneous French Creole culture previously. In many ways, the Irish were just like the Italians. They were mostly driven to New Orleans by political and economic troubles at home, and they mostly existed as a cheap labor force to be exploited by the wealthy Creoles and Americans. They too held their cultural traditions close in this strange new land, but since they spoke English, they had a broader acceptance among the white race. This meant that the Irish, more than any other ethnic minority in New Orleans, had an interest in supporting the Confederacy. They made up the large majority of the Confederate foreign regiments and served in the vanguard of many Civil War battles. During Reconstruction, this meant that the Irish voting bloc was one of the more reliable for the Democrats, and they were heavily involved in the white supremacist paramilitary groups. Competition for low-skill manual labor jobs brought the Irish into conflict with newly freed black people and Italian immigrants. As we will see later, competition within the working class will drive a lot of racial animosity in New Orleans, but it will sometimes create opportunities for acts of solidarity. The last groups that we will make note of are some that are not often discussed when covering the ethnic diversity of New Orleans. Groups like the Irish and Italians are prominent, mostly because of the sheer number of them that immigrated to the city during this time period, while groups like the Jews are prominent because despite the relatively small number of them, they have a big impact on the development of the city. One group, or rather a collection of groups that are often overlooked, are Asians. Prior to the end of the Civil War, the number of Asians living in Louisiana was, if not zero, then pretty close to that number. But just like how the end of slavery brought demand for poor Italians, it also caused the capitalists of New Orleans to look for new sources of labor. One of the hardest job markets to fill after the end of slavery was sugar plantations. The work was grueling and the pay was pathetic, so even desperate Irish and Italian immigrants steered clear of these farms. When looking for a solution to this problem, the wealthy of New Orleans were drawn to their old sister city of Havana. Here, in Cuba, they had faced a similar problem with the end of the Atlantic slave trade in 1867. Slavery was not yet illegal in Cuba, but without fresh souls being imported from Africa, they needed to supplement black slave labor with other people. Cubans found that their best bet was China, whose population had ballooned to over 450 million in 1850, and where a violent rebellion had caused many Chinese to seek foreign lands for safety. Sugar plantation owners around New Orleans saw how well the Chinese laborers worked in Cuba, and since they were huge racists, they attributed this success to some innate racial trait of Asians. So in 1866, the first Asian laborers were hired by a broker in New Orleans. But these men weren't Chinese. They came from the Spanish colony in the Philippines, but to the eyes of the white plantation owners, there was really no difference between them and the Chinese. Over the next few years, more Asian laborers arrived, this time both from the Philippines and China, until by the end of Reconstruction, there were enough of them and they were settled enough that we can declare with certainty that this was the creation of a long-lasting Asian community in New Orleans. The Filipinos found it easier to integrate themselves into the wider New Orleans society, since they came from a Spanish colony and many of them spoke Spanish. There was already a well-established Spanish community in New Orleans, and they mingled somewhat cohesively with the Filipinos. The Chinese, on the other hand, found it harder to feel at home in such a strange land, and much like the Sicilians, they tended to congregate together and practice their native traditions in a burgeoning Chinatown. That is where we will end this episode. The end of Reconstruction was really the end of the early American period of New Orleans history that ran from the Louisiana Purchase in 1813 to the withdrawal of federal troops in 1877. In the next few episodes, we will cover the early modern period of New Orleans, stretching from 1878 until somewhere in the mid-20th century. It was really during the Reconstruction period that we saw the birth of many of the things that are most associated with New Orleans today, and in the coming early modern period, we will see how the seeds planted during this turbulent era grew into the city we now know. So please join me next time for the history of New Orleans.